First of all, welcome to Bristol.
Thank you.
It's really amazing to welcome Warhorse here. Can I ask a personal question? How many times have you seen the productions?
I honestly don't know, but it must be 30 or 40 now, since I was first involved in it, which is now, 7 years ago, when the first time it was on the stage at the National Theatre. And I saw it, I think, once or twice then, very early on, and then quite a few times because it was very exciting and new and clearly being a big success, and it was lovely to go back and back. And then what I've done is to see the shows when they've gone to different places and they've gone to different countries. And what's been useful is not just seeing the show, is talking to the cast, because each time the cast changes in London, or each time it goes to Germany or Holland or wherever, what I hope been useful for is going to talk to the cast about the First World War, about where the story comes from, about my village in Devon, where it comes from, about farm life in Devon before the First World War, to give them some sort of context into which they can place this story that they're acting out. And I hope that serves a useful purpose. And just occasionally, if they're nice people, and they're always nice people, they about once a year invite me to join them on stage, and I put on a costume, and I go into the crowd scene and just become part of the background at the auction scene at the beginning and at the end, and I sing a song or two with them and feel part of the whole process. I'm very connected to it. It was the first book of mine that was ever at all successful. It wasn't very successful even then, but people read it, and I'm very fond of it. I wrote it in 1980, so we're talking about a really long time ago. It's written about the village that I live in, Iddesleigh in Devon, where I still live, and it's written about the place that my wife Claire really grew up in, so she's very connected to it, and it's a story which is very dear to our hearts.
I know when I've talked to the producers and actors in long-running stage shows before, that they say that every performance they try to tweak a little bit. Now, obviously, you can do that with a stage performance, but with your book, written 1980, I don't even want to think how many years ago that is. Do you ever look back at it and think, I wish I'd written perhaps that differently?
All the time. I mean, I think that's the nature of literature. If you go back and revisit it, whether it is on the stage or whether it's on the page, you always want to change something, because you always think, well, hang on, that doesn't quite work as well as it should. And that's the same on the page. There's certainly bits of Warhorse I wish I'd written now rather than then, because I'd have written it much better. But then I wouldn't, because I wasn't as fresh. I'm not as fresh now as I was then. My mind isn't quite as lively, I think, as it was then. So it had to be written then, at that time, with all its faults. And then you come to the stage show, and it's different. Every single time I see it, it's different. The actors bring new nuances to it, and the story's changed a bit and tweaked a bit. They do that, and I like that. I like the fact that National Theatre look at it and say, well, hang on, is that working as well as it should? And that they revisit it and they try to improve it. And you would say, I think, that from the first day it came out to the National Theatre stage all those years ago, it's recognisable, but an awful lot has changed, an awful lot, and for the better too, much better. It's much sharper now, and 20 minutes shorter, which is always good.
When they first approached you with the idea of using puppets to portray Joey, what was your initial reaction?
Well, it wasn't very positive. I was very thrilled that they'd asked National Theatre wanted to translate it to the stage. I thought that was just wonderful. I couldn't imagine how they were going to do it. It's about a horse in the First World War. How does that work on a stage? I could not bring my mind how that might happen. And then when Tom Morris, whose idea it was at the National Theatre to do this, said, well, actually what we're going to do, we're planning to use these puppeteers from South Africa called handspring puppets, and they're going to make life-size puppets of these horses. I thought, this is just absurd. How do you tell a story about something as epically dreadful, if you like, as the First World War through animal puppets? This really isn't going to work. And I was very disappointed. But more than that, worse than that, I thought it couldn't work. I didn't think it would happen. And as writers, story makers, what does happen very often with both plays and with television and film is that people get very enthusiastic. They say they're going to do a production, and it comes to nothing. So I thought, well, lovely idea, but it's not going to happen, certainly not with puppets. And boy, was I wrong. It took 2 years, mind, because I think they discovered as they went into it, and it was wonderful that they took the risk, because nothing like this had ever been done before. They really were pushing the barriers of theatre back, changing what you could do and what you couldn't do, just with this extraordinary play, and that's very daring. I think some people thought it was very stupid, and certainly unlikely to succeed, and I was certainly in that category. And then bit by bit you began to think, hang on, they're bringing really good people to this. They're bringing Ray Smith to do the design, John Tams to be the songmaker, Adrian Sutton to be the composer. Everyone they brought in was this little genius in their own world. And it began to be apparent to me that if these people got together, they could make something very special. And the puppetry was developing and changing all the time in the most extraordinary way. But even so, when it was the first night, I suppose you call it dress rehearsals, it was too long, it was clunky, and I thought, well, this isn't going to last more than a few weeks, and I think quite a lot of people there thought the same thing. But what's brilliant, they're so professional, these people, the cast and the directors and everyone got together and they shook this thing into shape, cut 20 minutes out of it, and by the time they'd finished we had this extraordinary play. And on the first night everyone was on their feet practically before the end, and I knew something amazing had happened. I think everyone did, but we weren't quite sure what, and we certainly weren't sure whether it was just a night and people thought, well, this is rather extraordinary, we're going to clap. But then when they were still standing up a week later and a month later and a year later and now 7 years later, these guys have just come back from South Africa. And they had standing ovation every single night in South Africa. And it affects people. And you know, I think the more terrible the world seems to be around us, the more people seem to respond to it. I mean, finally this is a play and everyone gets it by now, I think. It's called War Horse. It's really about love between a boy and a horse and a boy. And about reconciliation, about the possibility and hope of peace. And it seems to me that that's what touches people's hearts around the world. And it is very strange because whilst I thought, well, British people might respond to this, it's about British soldiers and the First World War, we kind of know, we've read our Wilfred Owen, we've read our Siegfried Sassoon, you know, we've kind of read All Quiet on the Western Front, it's all in our heads, oh what a lovely war. But is it going to work in America? The Americans aren't even connected to the First World War. It's part of, they came, did extraordinary things at the end of the First World War, won the war, so to speak, for us. But are they connected to that whole culture? And the truth is that when we went over there and we saw it in New York, and we saw it in Texas, it didn't matter that it was the First World War, because they weren't looking at the colour of the uniforms, the khaki and the grey, the British and the Germans. They were looking at two sides in a war. And what they understood instinctively, as they have done in South Africa, as they are doing in Holland at the moment where it is it's about any war. It's about any conflict at all. And it's about a victim. And the victim, the innocent victim, is this horse, representing the men as well, and the women, and the children who die in wars now. And the trouble is now we see it all around us. People are sitting there and they are thinking Afghanistan, and they are thinking Iraq, and they are thinking Syria, and now of course they're thinking Paris, because it goes on in people's heads.
I think actually my next question is slightly redundant after what you just said there, because you're obviously so impassioned and think it really has such a relevance to today's audience. Do you ever think, do you ever personally go, do you know, I want to move away from talking about War Horse, move on to I know you've written innumerable books.
Yeah.
Do you ever get a bit tired of talking about War Horse?
Yes, I do. I think probably, hand on heart, I've probably written my last war story now. I just finished it yesterday, in fact. And I think it will be my last. I think it's a very sad place to dwell. And I'm not sure I want to go back into it again. I mean, the problem is you are what you are. You can't create yourself anew. And I am a war child. I grew up out of the Second World War. Well, you can't lose that cloak. It is just part of it. And so when you write, I think you are going to write about difficulty probably, because my first understanding of the world about me was that it was a place where there was sadness and there was grief, but there was also hope and there was joy. And those things are going to be there whether it's in a war situation or not. But I think probably I have written my last story about war, yes.
Can I ask what your new story is called?
Well, the story I've just finished is called The Right Thing. And it's about a man who, during a war, thinks he does the right thing. and it turns out he has done the wrongest thing he could ever have thought of doing in a million years. And it's about how he deals with having done something that he thought was absolutely right and proper, and the opposite seems to be the case 20 years later, and it's how he deals with that and how it affects his life.
Is it a children's or an adult's book?
I don't know. Is War Horse a children's book? It's one of these things I'm never sure of. I worry about the whole phrase children's book, really, just as I do for a teen book or whatever. It seems to me that we can slice ourselves off from each other if we're not very careful. Children are no different from us. They're just smaller. They have the same emotions. They have the same connection to people around them, longing for closer relationships and understanding, hopes, fears. All those things are there when you're a small child. You don't lose them when you're older, and you don't lose them, as I'm discovering now, when you're an old person.